I think it's called Asian Civilizations Course. It's a wonderful anthology of writings. And I remember when I first read it, I was really knocked out by his writing and his thinking. If you want to call it thinking, it's something else, but it was terrific and still is. Yes?
Your writing has such a very in-the-moment feeling to it, where it's like you have these very long and very brief thoughts that tie together so seamlessly, but can give you a little bit of a jolt. And I'm just kind of wondering what's, I guess, how heavy of an editing process, like how much revision goes on in a lot of these ones. A lot of them feel very they bring you very much to feel like the moment you're thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
Or they're thinking.
Yeah. Could you all hear the question? He said that the poems, correct me if I'm wrong, that the poems often feel very much in the moment and just sort of being spun off in the moment. And he wondered if I did much editing or rewriting or changing. And the answer is, it depends. Especially, sometimes, it's true of a lot of people, I'm sure, have had the same experience, is you write a short poem and sometimes you look at it later and you think, I can't change it, it seems okay. And even a year or 5 years later, it still seems to hold up. Okay, well, that came out fine. It might have taken, well, the haiku, that poem I read called Haiku, you know, that was fast. I mean, live, it took me like 4 seconds to write that poem. And I didn't revise it. But other poems of mine, not just longer ones either, I do have to work on them a lot. I mean, the first drafts sometimes are dreadful. And, or there'll be something good about them maybe. And so I put them away and let them grow, turn green mold, grow on them and stuff. And then I scrape it off and try to fix them. And I still have some poems that I've been trying to fix for 30 years. Because I'm just rooting for them. I want them to be good, and they're recalcitrant. They just won't be good. But I'm working on it. But yeah, and the idea, of course, is to not let your work show. You know.
Have microphones. We can ask you questions at the microphone.
That means they have to get up, though. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Jim brought up found poems, and you found a Stephen Crane poem.
Mm-hmm.
The Ball of Gold in the Sky.
A man saw a ball of gold, yeah.
Yeah, and you changed just one word.
Yeah.
That's a pretty famous poem.
Mine or Stephen Crane's?
Yours now. Would you mind reading that? Because the combination is just glorious, I think.
Read it? If I can find it, yeah.
Oh, maybe not.
No, it's in this book here, but he's talking about the fact that I read a poem by Stephen Crane, and I went back and I rewrote his poem. I edited his poem because it wasn't quite good enough for me. And so I rewrote it. I changed just one word, though. And it was kind of I was like 21 when I did it, you know. I showed no respect for anything. And, yeah, just a minute. What's it called? A Man Saw a Ball of Gold. Oh, God, I got to look in the index. Index is longer than the book. Okay, a man. Is it interesting watching me look at this? I mean, who did this index? Jesus, it's awful. You know what? No, I'm not going to read it. I can't find it. If the book is too big, it's 800 pages long. I mean, who could find anything in here?
It's okay, let's go.
But I could answer other questions, and I could multitask. But at the time when I did this, I rewrote that poem in 1963, I think it was. And I was experimenting with found poems and rewriting existing poems. I took Robert Frost's poem, Birches, and I changed that one too. And to this day, I never can figure out. He says, when I see birches, I like to think some boy's been swinging them, I don't know about what birches is he looking at? Because birch trees, they go straight up, the limbs go kind of straight. They're not like elms or something. I mean, I don't see how you'd swing on a branch of a birch. I really don't. And I've asked New Englanders about it, and they say, I don't know. Yeah. So,
Okay.
what? Well, yeah, if they're being pulled down, but he doesn't say that. I don't know. He's a tricky guy. I don't know.
So
that
I
poem
have a
is disappearing.
question.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
I was wondering, you have such an interesting way of reciting your poems. I was wondering, do you prefer them to be read and heard out loud, or do you prefer them to be read silently?
Yeah. Everybody heard that. You have a beautiful voice, by the way, and it carries it nicely. To me, there are two different poems: the poem silent on the page and the poem in the ear. And actually, they're more than any poem is more than just those two. It's who's reading it, and how are they reading it, under what circumstances. What circumstances are you reading it under? Some days a poem will seem terrific. The next day, maybe not so good. So every poem has multiple existences, as far as I'm concerned. But I have written poems that aren't really very good for reading out loud. They weren't destined, let's say. No, that's too hoity-toity. They weren't conceived in the moment of being written. I didn't have a feeling for them being ever read out loud or even heard. They're eyeball page poems you read silently alone at home, and that's fine. And then there are others that I think take on a different life and a decent life when read out loud. But I don't really have any kind of rule as to how that happens. But I pick things to read, like tonight, for instance, that I feel I can read. And in a way, that's kind of a good test for those of you who write, is to read your work out loud at home, like silent to yourself. And if you get to phrases and lines that your tongue can't handle, maybe there's something wrong there. Maybe not, but maybe. It's usually an indicator there's something a little off. And then read it to somebody you know and trust, because then you'll have a different feeling about that poem. And then read it in public to an audience, and that's the ultimate test, I think. Because I've written poems that at home where I think, oh, that's pretty good. I read it out loud, and, oh, that's pretty good. I read it to my wife, she says, that's pretty good. And then I go read it to an audience, and I get to a certain part, and I realize, you know what? That line's phony. I faked that line. It lacks energy. I simply wrote it in order to get to the next line. And then I left it in. I made a mistake. And I go home and revise the poem as a result. There's something about, it's almost like a lie detector test or something when you read in public to people you don't know. Because then to me, the flaws in my own work just jump out at me, which I can't see when I'm at home alone. Yeah.
How do you?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the poem How to Be Perfect? How did you, the process in writing that, what did you leave out? How did you decide what order to put those statements in?
Yeah, she asked about the poem, the long thing, How to Be Perfect. Notice I call it a thing. And how did I write it, and what was the process? And basically that was your question, right? Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, the idea, the premise, if somebody telling people how to be perfect is so absurd, I like that a lot. It's like an attribute is not an attribute unless it's an attribute or something. I mean, I love the idea. Well, actually, somebody gave me that as an assignment. A fellow poet named Bernadette Mayer. Years ago, we'd gone to a party, and Bernadette had had a few. And we were going outside of this building in New York, and I was going to put her in a taxi and send her home. And we got over to the taxi, and she sort of was grabbing my arm. And she said, "Oh, Ron, you're so perfect. Why don't you write a poem that tells me how to be perfect, too?" And I said, oh, I'll definitely Bernadette. I'll do that as soon as I get home. Don't worry. You know, I put her in the cab, and off she went. And then I started thinking about it was such a ridiculous assignment that I thought, this is my kind of thing to do. I like it. And so I began to just write them down. And, you know, discreetly. I just had some here on a piece of paper here. They accumulated over a period of time. And then the question became, well, how do I put them together? And I had the different pieces of paper, like a collage, but without the glue. And I just shifted them around on a big table. And I tried to give a certain kind of pace to it. There's to say, there are certain serious ones, very serious ones. And then certain ones that are really off the wall. Do not practice cannibalism, for instance. Or someone murders your child, get a shotgun and blow his head off. I mean, things like that just jump out. So I tried to space these things so that the reader would constantly be off balance. And I thought that would help keep the poem a little fresher than if I grouped them according to categories. For instance, it would be very dull as categories, I think. Very dull. Because some of them are, by themselves, extremely dull. Wash after dinner, do the dishes. I mean, that's incredibly boring. But it's a little less boring placed where it is, because you're never quite sure what's coming next as a reader or listener, right?
How do you choose what to include in a book of poems? Do you just hey, here it is, I'll spell them all out, you know?
No. The question is, how do I know what to include in a book of poems? Well, mainly unpublished things first. And then I go back to see what's there, because honestly, I tend to forget what I've written. I write things, I put them away, and then I open the folder later and say, oh yeah, I wrote that. Or sometimes, did I write that? I must have. But I look at the available material, and I try to see if they could go together in a way that interested me. Actually, I've just had a new book that's just come out a few days ago. It's not available quite yet. I mean, I have an advanced copy. But that book was very interesting for me to put together, because the material in it is very disparate. And quite often, books of poetry tend to have a certain uniformity of tone, i.e. the voice of the author. Something I've never wanted to have. I just hate the idea of having a voice. And I know I'm contrary. But so this new book has all these disparate pieces, very, very disparate in tone, from extremely whacked out, long poem to 3 poems written for my grandson when he was born, which are very simple and were really written for him to read when he got to be 5 years old. And prose poems, and poems that have actually color images in them, printed in color. And, there's a lot of variety. So I actually love making books. I love putting books together. It's really fun. And I've got this publisher who seems to believe that I'm worth publishing, so those suckers keep publishing my books, and I keep getting to put them together. It's great. But it's interesting, because it's like, again, to use the word collage, it's like one big collage. I do construct every book, and from start to finish. I don't expect people to read them from start to finish, but for me, I get a certain pleasure in having the first poem be the first poem for a reason, and the last poem to be the last poem for a reason. But maybe it's a nutty, instinctive logic that I use that makes no sense to anyone else. I don't know.
I have a question.
I'm sorry, this gentleman was fast. I'll get you next. Okay, yeah.
My question is, you've lived in New York a very long time, right?
Oh, yeah, doesn't it show?
Well, I mean, that's what strikes me as I listen to your poems. You're obviously very tuned in and sensitive, but when I hear nothing about New York, I mean, maybe in the being perfect, there were some city-like images, but
Yeah.
it just struck me at the end of your reading that there wasn't anything that I heard about New York, and I was wondering if that was just, I don't know, a survival mechanism.
His question is, if I've lived in New York a long time, which is true, but he didn't hear much New York in the work itself. It's simply because of the selection tonight. I have a number of poems in which New York is a key player. My new book has a whole poem about New York, but there's New York that consists of the Empire State Building and the Statue of Liberty and Broadway and all that. And then there's a New York, there's a certain kind of energy that's in New York. I don't know if I have it anymore, but I certainly had it when I was in my 20s and 30s and 40s. And it was a kind of energy that went into the work that wouldn't have been there had I stayed in Tulsa where I grew up. So there are different ways that New York gets into things, yeah. This gentleman over here, yeah.
This question isn't about your work specifically, but I'm curious what you'd have to say about why it's not so common that people memorize their poems and perform them in like a bard or something. That tradition.
The question is, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is why don't more poets memorize their poems and recite them, right? Yeah. I don't know. I can't speak for other poets.
What about yourself?
Me? I can't imagine anything more boring than having to memorize my own poems. I'd rather watch Judge Judy. But there's certain poets, very good poets. Galway Connell was one who was a recipient here years ago, and Galway knew a lot of his poems by heart, and he loved memorizing his own poems. And he's a good poet, and he recited them beautifully. And I know a number of other poets too. There's a poet, kind of a performance poet in New York named John Giorno, who memorizes these astoundingly long poems. It's just unbelievable. He can stand and recite for 30 straight minutes, one long poem. But it's never been my strong suit, and I'm not that really interested in it. You reminded me of the first poem I did. Maybe this is the reason. When I was in junior high school in Tulsa, we were required to memorize a poem. And it turns out it was Emerson's, "By the rude bridge that arced the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world." And now, I memorized that when I was 13, and I can't get it out of my damned head. So maybe that's why I didn't want to memorize anymore. The funny thing is, at 13 in Tulsa, you read that, and it says, "By the rude bridge." I thought, how could a bridge be rude? I didn't get it. I figured out that poetry was not for me at that point. Yeah, anybody else? Yes, sir.
So one of the nice things that this organization does is, the collaborations with visual artists, visual artists.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a long tradition among New York writers. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with painters and visual artists?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because it's a lot of. His question had to do with the collaboration between poets and artists, such as we saw here, but in New York especially. Now I'm going to try to really restrict myself here because there's so much to say. There's a huge, beautiful book just published by Rizzoli, publisher, called "Painters and Poets of the New York School." It's brand new. It's a really very, very good book. And that's the short answer. Go find that book. Maybe, if I'd have known it was coming out, I'd have had the library buy it, But anyway, I got inspired to collaborate with artist friends. Actually, when I was in high school in Tulsa, one of my best friends was an artist named Joe Brainerd, and he and I were in kindergarten together. And in high school, we did collaborative work because he was the high school artist and I was the high school poet. We were the two nerdiest guys you can imagine. And so therefore we liked each other. But when I came to New York, I learned that Frank O'Hara had collaborated with Larry Rivers and Norman Bloom and Mike Goldberg and a lot of others and Grace Hardigan, and that Kenneth Koch had collaborated with Rivers and Red Grooms. And it was very inspiring. So Joe and I continued to collaborate. He moved to New York also. And then also I met Jim Dine in the 60s, and Jim and I did some work together, a book and a suite of lithographs, and actually he did the cover for my new book. It's so beautiful. This is unbelievable. And then Alex Katz and I did some, and others. I love collaborating with artists, but only with artists who are friends of mine. I just don't feel comfortable collaborating with just anybody. They might be good, but I need to feel on a certain wavelength right away with the artist. And if a really famous artist came to me and said, "Would you like to collaborate?" I don't think I'd do it. I mean, Jim and Alex are famous enough, but I had the good luck to meet them before they got real famous. So I don't have to deal with that crap. Anyway, that's a very short answer. I'm not the only one either. Oh, I do want to mention that one of my dearest and oldest friends who died a few years ago, George Snyman, an artist, and I did an enormous number of works together, enormous, 500 at least. And there was a beautiful show at Poets House in New York City last year, ran for 8 months, of George's collaborative work with poets. It was a gorgeous show. Anyway, any more? Bob's getting ready to leap from his chair and say something. What? A lot of work to get up out of a chair? I know the feeling, yeah.
Book signings and raffles and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
I just think it was a splendid performance.
Oh, thank you, Bob. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you again.
Oh, I found the poem, Stephen Crane's. We'll have a book signing now. Thank you all for coming. I need the yellow bag with all the yellow sheets in it, and we'll have the raffle for the broadside.
Bob, tell them if they have other questions, I'll be hanging around. Anybody else?
If you have another question for Ron, he'll take it over here. Did I get you right on that, Ron? Yeah. At the book signing. Last chance. Yellow bag.